The doctor's hand froze midair. The ultrasound screen went black. And in that silence, before anyone spoke, I knew whatever she had just seen wasn't about my baby. It was about my husband. I was lying on the examination table, cold gel spread across my stomach, my heart beating fast with anticipation. This appointment was supposed to be happy. The 20-week scan. The moment parents hear reassurance, see tiny movements, and fall even deeper in love with a life they haven't met yet. I'd imagined taking a photo of the screen, sending it to my husband, maybe crying a little. Instead, I was staring at darkness. I'd come alone. Ethan had another critical meeting. He kissed my forehead before leaving, promised we'd celebrate later. He always promised later these days. The technician had been warm at first, chatting casually while moving the probe, pointing out the curve of the spine, the flutter of movement. I smiled. I relaxed. I let myself believe everything was normal. Then she opened my file. Her eyes dropped to the paperwork. Her face changed so fast it felt like the air shifted. The smile vanished. Her shoulders stiffened. She swallowed hard, then looked back at the file again, as if hoping she'd misread something. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She didn't answer. She turned the monitor away from me and shut it off completely. The room felt suddenly smaller. My chest tightened. "What's wrong with my baby?" I asked, my voice already shaking. She set the probe down too carefully. "I need to get the doctor," she said, too quickly. "Please wait here." She left before I could ask anything else. The door clicked shut behind her. I stared at the blank screen, panic flooding my thoughts. Every nightmare rushed in at once. Complications. Loss. Bad news, doctors soften with careful words. I pressed my palm to my stomach, whispering for my baby to be okay. When the door opened again, it wasn't the technician who came in. It was Dr. Helena Moore, the senior obstetrician. Late 50s. Calm, composed, respected. The kind of woman whose presence usually steadied you. Today, her hands were shaking. She didn't look at the ultrasound machine. She didn't look at my stomach. She looked at the file. At the name printed at the top. My husband's name. "Mrs. Cole," she said quietly, closing the door. Then she locked it. My heart dropped. "Is my baby?" "Your baby is healthy," she said gently. Relief crashed through me so hard, I almost cried. Then she added, "But you are not safe."
Ich zerrte her, confused. "What?"
She pulled a chair close and sat across from me, lowering her voice even though we were alone. "I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to say will shock you." My hands were trembling. "Doctor, please. You need to leave your husband," she said. "Today. Before you go home. Before he knows that you know." I actually laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. "That's not funny. I'm not joking." "You must be mistaken," I said. "Ethan would never." "Please," she said softly. "Just let me explain." She stood, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a thick folder. When she placed it on the desk between us, her fingers brushed mine. They were cold. "What I'm about to show you," she said, "will change everything you think you know about your marriage. My name is Lena Cole. I'm 34 years old. I work as a senior project consultant for a private real estate firm in Massachusetts. I manage contracts worth millions, oversee deadlines that decide careers, and make decisions that affect entire developments. I'm good at reading numbers, risks, and people in boardrooms. But I never thought I could miss something this big in my own life. 3 years ago, my father died suddenly of a heart attack. No warning.
No good vie.
He left me a portfolio valued at just over $4 million, held mostly in trusts and long-term investments, and a historic Beacon Hill brownstone that had been in our family for generations. I never flaunted it. I worked full-time. I lived modestly. The money was security, not identity. But it made me a target. I met Ethan 4 years ago at a conference in Chicago. He asked a thoughtful question after my presentation. We talked over coffee. He was charming without being pushy, confident without arrogance. He said he worked in financial strategy. He never asked about my assets. That felt refreshing. My best friend Mara wasn't convinced.
He feels rehearsed, she said.
My mother was blunter. Men who watch that closely are always calculating. I ignored them both. I wanted to believe I'd found something real. Ethan proposed after 18 months.
Quiet.
Private. He said he wanted a life with me, not my money. I believed him. We married 6 months later. For the first year, he was attentive, supportive, patient. When we decided to have a baby, it felt right. It didn't happen easily. Tests were ordered. Results came back. Ethan had severe male factor infertility. Natural conception was almost impossible. He cried in the parking lot afterward, apologizing like it was his fault. I held him and told him we'd figure it out together. We chose IVF. Ethan insisted on finding the clinic himself. I want the best, he said.
No mistakes.
At the time, I thought that was love. Dr. Moore opened the folder. Inside were clinic records, internal emails, payment logs. My niece works at the fertility clinic you used, she said quietly. 3 weeks ago, she came to me crying. She said she couldn't live with what she'd helped do. My stomach dropped. Help do what? Your husband paid clinic staff to switch genetic material during your IVF cycle. I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. He replaced his sperm with donor sperm without your knowledge, she said. The room went silent.
Why?
I whispered. Because this pregnancy was never about becoming a father, Dr. Moore said. It was about setting a trap. She slid a document toward me. Transfer dates. Authorization signatures that weren't mine.
Proof.
And this, she said, closing the folder, is only the beginning. I looked up at her, my life suddenly split into before and after. What else did he do? Dr. Moore's voice dropped to a whisper. He built this plan assuming you would break. And in that moment, sitting alone in a locked medical office, I realized the man sleeping beside me every night had never been my husband at all. I didn't cry in Dr. Moore's office. I didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't ask her to repeat herself a dozen times the way people do in movies. I just sat there, staring at the folder, my mind strangely calm, as if it had stepped outside my body and was watching someone else's life fall apart.
Shock does that.
It numbs before it hurts. Dr. Moore kept talking, carefully, slowly, as if afraid a wrong word might shatter me. She explained how her niece had been approached months earlier by a well-dressed man who claimed he needed discretion. How he said his wife didn't know, how it was for her own good, how he offered money in an amount that would change a young nurse's life overnight.
$32,000.
Enough to erase debt. Enough to buy silence. Enough to destroy my marriage. I remember nodding as she spoke, as if this were a presentation at work and not the autopsy of my trust. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice kept repeating one thing over and over. This can't be real. You don't marry men like this. You don't build a life with them. Dr. Moore finally stopped talking and waited. You don't have to decide anything right now, she said. But you cannot go home and act like nothing happened. Not yet. I stood up on legs that felt unfamiliar. He doesn't know you know, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. No, she replied. And he can't. Not until you're protected. I promised her I wouldn't confront him. I promised her I'd be careful. She handed me copies of the documents and pressed her card into my palm like she was afraid I might disappear. When I walked out of the clinic, the sun was blinding. The parking lot was full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Laughing. Arguing on phones. Living lives that hadn't just cracked in half. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes before turning the key, breathing slowly, forcing my hands not to shake. Ethan texted me while I was driving home. How did it go? Everything okay with the baby? I stared at the screen until the light turned red. Then I typed back, perfect. Baby's healthy. I even added a heart. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the shock had started to fade. Something else was taking its place. Something colder. Sharper. I walked into the house we shared, the house I had helped pay for, the house where I had planned to raise a child, and I looked at it with new eyes. The couch where we'd curled up together. The kitchen table where he'd held my hands and talked about the future. None of it felt real anymore.
It felt staged.
Like a set. Ethan was already home. Earlier than usual. He was standing in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, stirring something on the stove. He turned when he heard the door, smiling wide, that familiar, practiced smile.
"There she is," he said.
I was worried. You didn't text right away. I stepped into his arms when he hugged me. His body felt warm.
Solid.
Normal. I wondered how many times he'd held me while lying straight to my face. "Everything okay?" he asked, pulling back just enough to study my expression. This was the moment I realized. The moment he checked for cracks. I smiled. Baby's perfect. The tension left his shoulders so visibly it almost startled me. "I knew it," he said, kissing my forehead. I wish I'd been there. I almost laughed at how convincing he sounded. That night, I watched him closely. The way he spoke. The way he touched me. The way he avoided my eyes for half a second too long when money came up. All the little things I dismissed over the past year lined up neatly, like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. The late-night calls. The phone always face down. The new passwords. The sudden concern about updating my will once I got pregnant. The way he'd casually suggested adding his name to my trust for the baby's security. The way he joked about selling the brownstone because it was too much responsibility for a new mom. I'd thought it was practicality. It was preparation. Over the next few weeks, I played my role perfectly. The happy, trusting wife. I apologized for being emotional lately. Blamed hormones. Used his own words back at him. I watched him relax every time I reassured him I was fine. Every time I didn't ask questions. Every time I let him believe the ground beneath his feet was solid. Inside, I was cataloging everything. I noticed how often he stepped outside to take calls. How he lowered his voice. How he started coming home later again. When I asked casually, he snapped once, sharp and defensive, then immediately softened, wrapping it in concern. "I just don't want you stressed," he said. "It's not good for the baby." He said that a lot. Always the baby. Always concern. Always control disguised as care. One night, I woke up and found him sitting on the edge of the bed, phone glowing in his hand. He jumped when he realized I was awake. "Sorry," he said. "Couldn't sleep." I watched him slip the phone under the pillow like a teenager hiding something from a parent. That was when I understood something else. Whatever he was planning hadn't stopped with the IVF. It was still unfolding. I called Dr. Moore 2 days later and asked her who else knew. She hesitated, then gave me a name. A private investigator she trusted. A woman who specialized in financial fraud and domestic deception. I didn't call right away. First, I needed to be sure of one thing. I checked our prenup. I hadn't looked at it in years. It had seemed like a formality at the time, something lawyers insisted on because of my assets. I remembered skimming it, trusting Ethan when he said it was fair to both of us. It wasn't. There was an infidelity clause. If one spouse cheated, they forfeited claims and owed damages. A lot of them. If I cheated. Suddenly, the pieces aligned with terrifying clarity. The donor sperm. The future DNA test. The altered clinic records Dr. Moore hinted at. The careful timing of everything. He wasn't just lying to me. He was building evidence against me. That night, lying beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing even out as he slept, I felt something shift inside me. The fear burned away, replaced by something steady and deliberate. He thought I was weak. He thought pregnancy had softened me, made me emotional, made me easy to manipulate. He thought I would crumble when the truth came out the way he planned it to. He was wrong. The next morning, I called the investigator. Her name was Claire Hensley, former federal analyst. Calm voice. No wasted words. I met her 2 days later in a coffee shop an hour away, careful not to take my car directly there. Paranoid, maybe, but paranoia felt reasonable now. I told her everything. From the ultrasound room to the folder on my kitchen counter I hadn't dared open again. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily. When I finished, she looked up and said, "Your husband didn't just lie to you. He committed fraud." That word hit differently.
Fraud. Crime.
Not betrayal. Not heartbreak. Something colder. More actionable. We can prove it, she continued. But you have to keep playing along. I smiled slightly. I've been doing that my whole marriage. She nodded.
Good.
Because the more comfortable he is, the sloppier he'll get. As I left that meeting, my phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Miss you already.
Can't wait to hold you tonight.
I typed back, me too. And for the first time since the ultrasound room, I meant something behind the smile. I wasn't lying anymore. I was setting the stage. Once I hired Claire, my life split into two perfectly separated versions. There was the life Ethan saw, and then there was the one I lived quietly underneath it. On the surface, I was still the same woman he thought he'd married, pregnant, emotional, compliant, grateful for his support. Underneath, every word he spoke became data. Every action a pattern. Claire moved quickly but carefully. She told me not to dig on my own, not to change my routines, not to suddenly become curious about things I'd ignored for years. People like your husband survive on predictability, she said. The moment you change, they feel it. So I didn't change. I smiled at his jokes. I let him rub my stomach when other people were around. I listened when he talked about the future, about college funds and investments and how we should start consolidating assets now that a baby was coming. Every time he said we, my stomach twisted. Within a week, Claire confirmed the first thing she'd suspected. Ethan had money problems. Not small ones. Not the kind you fix by cutting back on dinners or canceling a vacation. He had debt, 6 figures of it, spread across credit lines, private loans, and accounts I'd never seen. Gambling debts. Sports betting. High-risk online poker games. Losses hidden behind clever transfers and business expenses. I remembered every weekend he'd claimed to be at conferences. Every night, he'd come home exhausted but wired. I remembered how he'd laughed once and said, "I'm good at calculated risks." At the time, I'd thought he meant work. Claire also found something else. The fertility clinic wasn't the only place he'd been busy. He'd been having an affair. 8 months long. With a woman who worked under him. Hotel rooms paid for in cash. Dinners charged to a card I didn't recognize. Messages carefully deleted, but not completely erased. I thought I'd feel devastated when I heard that part. Instead, I felt validated. The distance. The coldness. The way he'd stopped touching me but framed it as concern for the baby. It hadn't been about respect or fear. It had been about logistics. Then came the part that made everything click into place. Claire traced a series of payments tied to the IVF timeline. Transfers routed through shell accounts. Cash withdrawals that matched the dates on the clinic records Dr. Moore had shown me. Ethan hadn't just paid one person. He'd paid several. Quietly. Efficiently. Like a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed more than once in his head. "He's done this before," Claire said one afternoon, sliding another file across the table. Inside was a name. A woman from Boston. Family money. Trust fund. Relationship that ended abruptly years ago. Financial irregularities discovered too late. No charges filed. Too much embarrassment. Too much self-blame. Ethan hadn't married me because he loved me. He'd married me because he'd refined his method. The realization didn't hurt the way betrayal usually does. It hardened me. I stopped mourning the marriage I thought I had and started studying the enemy I actually faced. Meanwhile, Ethan grew more confident by the day. He started talking openly about the future again. About how once the baby was born, we should simplify things. He suggested, again, that we revisit the prenup just to make sure everything was aligned. I nodded. I asked questions that sounded innocent. I let him explain things slowly, like I was fragile, like pregnancy had dulled my intelligence. Every explanation he gave me only confirmed what Claire was uncovering behind the scenes. One evening over dinner he mentioned DNA tests casually. Framed it as sentimental. "Wouldn't it be amazing," he said, smiling, "to frame something like that in the nursery? Proof of us. Of family." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I forced myself to keep breathing evenly. "That's sweet," I said. He watched my face carefully, waiting for resistance. I gave him none. That was the moment I knew his plan was entering its final phase. "Claire, and I met the next morning. She didn't sugarcoat it. He's setting you up to be accused of infidelity. Once the DNA test happens, he'll claim he's the victim. With the prenup, the financial damage to you would be massive. And the baby? I asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. Collateral. I pressed my hand to my stomach instinctively. The baby kicked softly, unaware of the war being planned around them. What do we do? I asked. Claire leaned back, calm, almost amused. We let him keep going.
Ist sehr daher.
That's it. No, she said. We let him think he's winning. The next few weeks were the hardest. Pretending takes energy. Smiling when you want to scream. Listening when every word feels contaminated. I cried in the shower. I cried in my car. I never cried in front of him. I reconnected with my mother during that time. Quietly.
Carefully.
I told her everything in one long phone call that ended with both of us silent on the line, breathing. I tried to warn you, she said finally. I know, I whispered. Then she surprised me. We'll fix this. She connected me with a lawyer she trusted. A woman who specialized in financial crimes and high-asset divorces. Someone who didn't flinch when I laid out the evidence. Your husband is arrogant, the lawyer said after reviewing the files. That's good. Arrogant men leave trails. The plan took shape slowly, deliberately. Nothing rushed. Nothing emotional. Every step documented. Every witness prepared. Every piece of evidence secured in multiple places. Ethan noticed none of it. In fact, he seemed happier than he had in months. Lighter. Almost relieved. The closer he got to his imagined victory, the more careless he became. He started rehearsing conversations out loud when he thought I couldn't hear. Practicing concern. Practicing heartbreak. Practicing the role of the betrayed husband. Sometimes I watched him and wondered how someone could lie so completely and still sleep at night. Then I stopped wondering. Some people don't feel guilt. They feel entitlement. By the time Ethan suggested hosting a small family gathering to celebrate the baby, I knew exactly what it would become. And so did Claire.
Public, she said.
That's where he wants to destroy you. That's where you take him down. I agreed without hesitation. Because by then, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure he never did this to another woman again. By the time Ethan suggested the gathering, I already knew he thought he was close to the end. He framed it as something sweet, something healing. A small family get-together before the baby arrived. Just the people who matter, he said, squeezing my hand a little too tightly. I want everyone to see how strong we are.
Strong.
The word almost made me smile. Behind the scenes, Claire and my lawyer were piecing together the full anatomy of his plan. Not just the IVF manipulation, but the legal choreography designed to strip me of everything once the lie reached daylight. Ethan hadn't acted on impulse. He'd acted like a man who believed the system existed to reward intelligence, not morality. It started long before the pregnancy. Years earlier, he'd quietly built a financial narrative around himself. Modest income. Smart investments. A man working his way up. He positioned me as the wealthy spouse with emotional volatility. Emails saved out of context. Texts where I sounded anxious or overwhelmed. Conversations where he encouraged me to quit my job for my health, knowing it would make me look dependent later. He'd even pushed therapy at one point. Not because I needed it, but because medical records could be selectively framed. Stress. Anxiety. Pregnancy hormones. The perfect backdrop for doubt. The IVF was the centerpiece. If the child wasn't biologically his, the prenup clause would activate. If he could prove infidelity, or even imply it convincingly, he'd be entitled to damages, assets, and control of the narrative. The donor sperm wasn't random either. Claire traced it back to a private bank with limited disclosure, chosen specifically to slow verification. The DNA test he planned to suggest publicly would be the trigger.
Shock.
Sympathy. Accusations. A man blindsided by betrayal. A woman too stunned to defend herself. He would file first. Control the timeline. Control the story. Except he'd made one critical mistake. He'd assumed I would panic. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I learned. I memorized dates, transactions, names. I learned how money moved when it wanted to disappear and how it reappeared when you followed the right threads. I learned the language of legal filings, the rhythm of courtrooms, the difference between suspicion and proof. And I learned how men like Ethan behaved when they thought the ending was already written. At home, I continued to play the role he expected. I let him talk. I let him plan. I let him explain things to me slowly, patiently, like I was fragile. Every time he underestimated me, he handed me another advantage. The night before the gathering, he sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through his phone, looking pleased with himself. "Tomorrow will be good," he said casually. "A fresh start." I leaned my head against his shoulder. "I trust you," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, not because they were lies, but because they were no longer weapons he could use against me. The gathering was scheduled at the brownstone. My brownstone. The one he'd tried to convince me to sell. Family, close friends, a few people from his work. Casual. Intimate. Public enough to sting. Claire and my lawyer were already there when the first guests arrived. Officially, they were friends. Observers. Unofficially, they were witnesses. Ethan was in his element.
Charming.
Attentive. The perfect husband-to-be father. He poured drinks. Told stories. Touched my back just often enough to reinforce the image he wanted everyone to see. I watched him like I'd watch a stranger. At one point, he raised his glass and made a toast. He talked about love, about trust, about how fragile relationships could be when tested. His voice cracked in exactly the right place. A performance honed to perfection. I saw people glance at me sympathetically. He was laying the groundwork. When the moment came, it was almost subtle. He set his glass down and sighed, like a man burdened by honesty. "There's something I think we should talk about," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. Something I didn't want to bring up like this, but I believe in transparency. My heart didn't race. It slowed.
He looked at me then.
"I think the baby deserves the truth. Don't you?" I met his gaze.
Calm.
Steady. "Yes," I said.
Ido.
That wasn't the answer he expected. He hesitated for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker across his face, then continued. He mentioned the infertility diagnosis, the IVF, the DNA test he wanted to do for peace of mind. He framed it as concern, as hurt, as quiet devastation. People shifted uncomfortably. When he finished, silence filled the room. That's when I spoke. "I already know," I said gently. He blinked. "Know what?" I turned to Claire. She nodded once. "I know you paid clinic staff to replace your sperm with donor material," I said. "I know you did it without my consent. I know you planned to accuse me of infidelity once the DNA test came back. And I know why." The room froze. Ethan laughed nervously. "Lena, this isn't." My lawyer stepped forward. "Actually," she said, "it is." She laid the documents out on the table. Payment records, emails, clinic testimony, affidavits. Everything Ethan had thought was buried. His face drained of color. "You don't understand," he started, but his voice had lost its confidence. "This is being taken out of context."
Claire spoke next.
"So are the gambling debts, the affairs, the previous victim who signed an NDA because she didn't know she wasn't alone." That was when Ethan finally looked afraid. Someone asked if this was real. Someone else reached for their phone. I hadn't raised my voice once. "I trusted you," I said quietly. "And you built an entire strategy around destroying me. You thought I'd break."
I smiled then.
Just slightly. "You miscalculated." Sirens cut through the air minutes later. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Just inevitable. As officers stepped inside, Ethan looked at me one last time. For the first time since I'd met him, he wasn't in control. And for the first time in months, I could breathe. The police didn't take Ethan away in handcuffs that night.
Not yet.
Crimes like his don't end with dramatic takedowns in living rooms, no matter how badly movies want them to. Instead, they took statements. They collected documents. They asked careful questions. And they warned him, very calmly, not to leave the state. That calm was what finally broke him. After the guests were ushered out and the house fell quiet, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. The confident man who had rehearsed my humiliation for months looked small now, stripped of his audience and his script. "You planned this," he said hoarsely without looking at me. I leaned against the counter, one hand resting on my stomach.
No, irraplia.
"You did. I just stopped you from finishing it." He looked up then, anger flashing through the fear. "You think you've won? You don't understand how this works. Nothing's been proven yet." He was right about one thing. The process was just beginning. That night, Claire stayed with me. She slept on the couch, one eye open, phone charging beside her. Paranoia had stopped feeling irrational. When someone has invested this much time and effort into destroying you, you don't assume they'll accept failure gracefully. Over the next few weeks, the investigation expanded rapidly. What had started as reproductive fraud opened doors into financial crimes that reached farther than even Claire had expected. Subpoenas were issued, bank accounts frozen, records unsealed. The shell companies Ethan had used to hide debt and funnel payments collapsed under scrutiny. And then the other women started coming forward. At first, it was just one. The woman from Boston Claire had warned me about. She contacted my lawyer after seeing a brief mention of Ethan's case in a legal bulletin. Her voice shook when she spoke to me on the phone, like mine probably would have months earlier. "I thought I was stupid," she said. "I thought I'd imagined it." She hadn't. Neither had I. Then another woman. And another. Different cities. Different timelines. Same pattern.
Charming man.
Quiet marriage. Financial pressure disguised as partnership. Legal traps sprung when they were most vulnerable. Settlements signed out of shame and fear. By the time the fourth woman reached out, the narrative had fully shifted. Ethan wasn't a misunderstood husband or a victim of circumstance. He was a predator who specialized in patience. Watching it unfold was surreal. Every new detail confirmed something I'd felt but couldn't name during my marriage. The way he always needed control. The way affection came with conditions. The way love felt transactional, even when I couldn't articulate why. The courts moved faster once the scope became clear. Reproductive coercion.
Fraud.
Financial manipulation. Evidence tampering. Charges stacked quietly, methodically. There was no spectacle, no grand speeches. Just the slow, grinding sound of accountability closing in. Ethan tried to contact me constantly at first. Apologies. Justifications. Threats disguised as concern. Messages that swung wildly between regret and rage. I didn't respond to any of them. My lawyer advised a full no-contact order, and I followed it without hesitation. The silence felt like oxygen. As the legal process advanced, something unexpected happened inside me. The anger I'd been carrying began to loosen its grip. Not because what he'd done hurt less, but because it no longer defined me. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. I focused on my body, on my baby, on rebuilding trust in myself. Therapy became a space for clarity rather than confusion. For the first time, I wasn't trying to make sense of someone else's behavior. I was learning to honor my own instincts. The final blow came quietly. Ethan's attorney approached mine with an offer. A plea deal. Full admission of guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. No trial. No public spectacle. Just resolution. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. I felt relief. Relief that it was over. Relief that the baby growing inside me would never know that man the way I had. Relief that the cycle had been interrupted. When Ethan stood before the judge weeks later, I didn't attend. I didn't need to see him smaller or humbled or broken. Justice isn't always about witnessing punishment. Sometimes it's about reclaiming peace. The court ruled in my favor on every count. Assets returned. Trust secured. Restraining orders finalized. His name removed from my life legally and permanently. That night, I sat alone in the brownstone, the same walls that had once held his voice now echoing with quiet. I placed both hands on my stomach and whispered promises I intended to keep. "You're safe," I told my child. "And so am I." Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the war that had ended inside one woman's life. And for the first time since the ultrasound room, the future felt like something I owned again. The months that followed felt almost surreal. Ethan was gone from my life completely, stripped of every illusion he had built, but the quiet he left behind was heavy with reflection. I spent mornings walking through the brownstone, sunlight spilling over the hardwood floors, feeling the heartbeat of the life inside me and realizing that strength didn't come from revenge alone. It came from surviving, from learning who you truly are when the world is intent on tearing you apart. Claire and my lawyer remained in touch, not because I needed protection anymore, but because they became witnesses to my own transformation. I realized I had been living in a shadow for years, waiting for someone else to validate me, to protect me, to tell me I was right to suspect, right to doubt. Now I was the one in control. When the baby arrived, it was not just a new life, but a symbol of reclamation. Every tiny finger, every heartbeat, every soft cry reminded me that what was taken from me could be rebuilt, not by someone else, but by me. Friends and family gathered, cautious, but happy, seeing only the joy we deserved. Not once did Ethan enter my mind during those first precious weeks. He existed now only in the lessons he inadvertently taught me. And those lessons were clear. Trust your instincts, never underestimate your own strength, and no one, no matter how intelligent or manipulative, can dictate your worth. I returned to work slowly, deliberately, knowing I could handle everything I once feared. I negotiated contracts with a sharper mind, managed teams with patience, and smiled more freely than I had in years. Money, power, assets, they were no longer sources of vulnerability but tools I understood and controlled. I donated anonymously to organizations supporting women trapped in deceptive marriages, giving them what I had almost lost: hope. Each act, small or large, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been targeted for exploitation. Sometimes I thought about the past, the dinners, the whispers, the smiles that had hidden betrayal. Sometimes I even allowed a flicker of sadness, mourning the innocence I had lost. But grief did not weaken me. It strengthened my empathy, my resolve. The people who had doubted me, the warnings I'd ignored, they became a reminder to trust myself first. I had been underestimated for decades, but now I knew my own power. I wasn't fragile, I wasn't naive, and I wasn't helpless. Ethan's story faded from headlines and conversations, but the moral of our shared tragedy remained vivid. Life would test you, deceit would seek you, and the smartest manipulator might seem unstoppable. But intelligence without conscience is hollow, and cruelty always leaves traces. Those traces can be followed, exposed, and turned against the person who thought they were untouchable. And for me, they had been. On quiet evenings, I would hold my child close and remember the doctor, the investigator, the lawyers, the women who spoke up, and most importantly, myself. I realized that the most profound strength lies not in punishment, but in endurance, in careful strategy, and in choosing to rise even when every foundation you trusted is cracked. I had survived betrayal, I had survived manipulation, and I had survived fear. I was not just a mother, a survivor, or a professional. I was a force who would never again allow anyone to define her limits. And so, I whispered the promise one last time, not as a warning to others, but as a vow to myself. No one will ever take your peace again. Because the truth, as I had learned through pain, cunning, and courage, is that strength isn't given. It's claimed. And once claimed, it cannot be stolen.